My mother's funeral was held on a Tuesday, which felt wrong somehow. Funerals should happen on gray, rainy days, not on a bright October afternoon with the maple trees outside the church burning gold and red like they hadn't gotten the message that something terrible had happened. My name is Diane. I'm 58 years old, and 3 days before that Tuesday, I had held my mother's hand in a hospital room while a machine counted out the last of her breaths in slow, shallow numbers. I had been the one who flew in every 6 weeks for the last 2 years. I had been the one who sat with her through chemo, who learned to give her injections, who memorized the exact way she liked her tea, barely steeped, more milk than water. I had been, I thought, a good daughter. My younger sister Karen had been there too. Not as often as me. She lived only 20 minutes from Mom, while I was a 4-hour flight away. But she'd been there. And in the last 6 months, something had shifted. Karen started going over more, started handling the paperwork, she said. Started answering Mom's phone when I called, telling me Mom was resting or not up for talking today. I told myself it was fine. I told myself grief makes people territorial, that Karen just wanted to feel useful, that this wasn't a competition. I have spent most of my adult life telling myself things were fine when some quiet, animal part of me already knew they weren't. The church was full. My mother had been a school teacher for 31 years, and half of them seemed to have come. Grown men and women in their 40s and 50s telling me through tears how Mrs. Ellery had taught them to read, had stayed after class to help them with long division, had given them her own lunch when they came to school hungry. I stood at the door for an hour, shaking hands, hugging strangers who weren't strangers to her. Karen stood beside me, dressed sharply in black, her face composed in that particular way she has, the face of someone performing grief rather than drowning in it. I don't say that unkindly. Karen has always processed things by controlling them. When our father died 11 years ago, she reorganized his entire garage within a week. Grief, for Karen, looks like action. But there was something else in her that day. A watchfulness. Every so often I'd catch her glancing toward the back pew, where a man named Roy Bettinger sat. An old family friend, someone who'd known our parents since before Karen and I were born, who'd become, in recent years, something like Karen's unofficial financial advisor. He ran a small property business on the side. I'd never thought much of him one way or another. That day, though, I noticed Karen lean toward him during the reception, the two of them speaking low, heads bent together like conspirators at a wedding rather than mourners at a funeral. "Everything okay?" I asked her when Roy had stepped away to get a drink. "Fine," Karen said. "We'll talk about the house stuff later. No rush." The house stuff. Said so lightly. Said with her eyes somewhere over my shoulder. "What house stuff?" "The will, Diane. The estate. It's not a today conversation." She touched my arm, the way you'd touch the arm of someone you were trying to calm down, though I hadn't raised my voice at all. "Let's just get through today." I nodded. I let it go because that's what I do. I let things go. I give people the benefit of the doubt. I assume the best because assuming the worst about your own sister at your mother's funeral feels like a kind of sin. But that night, lying awake in my childhood bedroom, the one Karen had weeks earlier quietly turned into a home office, though she hadn't mentioned that either until I found the boxes of my old yearbooks stacked in the hallway. I kept hearing the way she'd said, "We'll talk about the house stuff later." We. Not you and me. We. Like there was already a conversation happening that I wasn't part of. I didn't sleep much. I lay there in the dark of the house my mother had lived in for 34 years, listening to it settle and creak the way old houses do, and for the first time since the diagnosis 18 months earlier, I let myself feel something other than grief. I let myself feel afraid. The family meeting happened 4 days later, on a Saturday morning, in the living room where I had once done homework at the coffee table, while my mother graded papers in the armchair across from me. Karen had set out coffee and a plate of pastries, like this was a business meeting and not the dismantling of our mother's life. She had a folder, a slim manila folder, the kind you'd buy at an office supply store, not the kind that usually holds something as significant as a will. That detail bothered me before I even understood why. "I want to be up front," Karen said, sliding a document across the coffee table toward me without quite meeting my eyes. "This isn't easy for me either." I picked up the papers. It was, ostensibly, my mother's last will and testament dated 4 years earlier. I read through the language slowly, the way you read something you don't want to be true, hoping that if you go slowly enough, the words will rearrange themselves into something kinder. They didn't. The will named Karen as sole beneficiary of the house, the modest investment accounts, and what remained of my father's life insurance payout. I was not mentioned. Not once. Not even a token gesture. No keepsake, no small inheritance, nothing. My name simply wasn't in the document at all, as if I had never existed as her daughter. "I was left out," I said. My voice came out strange to my own ears, flat and far away. "Mom and I got a lot closer at the end," Karen said, and there was something rehearsed in the way she said it, like she'd practiced this speech in the mirror. "You have your own life, Diane. Your career, your kids are grown, you're doing well. Mom knew that. I think she just wanted to make sure I'd be taken care of, since I never—" She stopped herself. "Since things didn't work out the same way for me." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think a lot of women my age know this feeling and don't talk about it enough. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was a kind of disorientation, like the floor had tilted 3 degrees and every object in the room was now slightly wrong. I thought about every phone call over the last 2 years, every flight I'd taken, every hour spent in waiting rooms and pharmacy lines. None of that had been about money. I want to be clear about that. I never once thought about inheritance while my mother was dying. But to be so completely erased from the document that was supposed to represent her final wishes? It didn't just hurt my finances. It felt like being told I had never mattered to her at all. "Can I keep a copy of this?" I asked. Karen hesitated, just a flicker, and then nodded. "Of course. I'm not trying to hide anything from you." I left that morning with the copy folded into my purse, and I did something I'm not proud of. I drove past the house 3 days later, not to confront Karen, just to sit outside it, the way you sometimes need to look at a thing to believe it's really happening. And that's when I found the locks had been changed. A new brass deadbolt gleamed on the front door where the old, slightly tarnished one used to be. I sat in my car for a long moment before I got out and walked next door to Mrs. Petrosky's house, our elderly neighbor since I was in elementary school, a woman who noticed everything on that street and had for 40 years. "Oh, Diane, honey," she said, opening her door before I'd even finished knocking. "I wondered when you'd come by. Karen's been in and out of there almost every day. Had some man with a clipboard walking around the yard last week. Real estate fella, I think. Measuring things." "A realtor?" That's what it looked like to me. "And a locksmith, Tuesday before last." Mrs. Petrosky's eyes were kind but sharp. "I don't mean to speak out of turn, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Your mother loved that garden. Couldn't imagine her wanting it sold off so fast." I thanked her and walked back to my car. I didn't go up to the door. I didn't call Karen right then to demand an explanation, though every muscle in my body wanted to. I just sat there, in the driver's seat of a rental car, staring at the house where I'd taken my first steps, where my father had taught me to ride a bike in the driveway, where my mother had sat by the window every evening with a cup of tea and a library book. Locked out of my own childhood. 4 days after learning I'd been erased from her will. Something in me went very quiet and very still. Not defeated. Something else. Something that felt, for the first time in a long time, clear. Grief has a way of scrambling your memory, pulling things out of order, resurfacing conversations you didn't know you'd kept. In the days after I sat outside that locked house, I found myself replaying the last 18 months of my mother's life on a kind of loop, searching for something. I didn't know what, exactly, only that some instinct in me insisted there was something to find. And slowly, pieces started surfacing. I remembered a Tuesday about 14 months earlier. I remembered because it was the week of my granddaughter's birthday, when my mother had called me, her voice careful in a way that was unusual for her. She'd said, almost in passing, "I had some paperwork done, nothing to worry about, just tidying things up the way you do at my age." I hadn't thought much of it at the time. People my mother's age talk about tidying up paperwork the way other people talk about the weather. It's a background hum of aging, not usually a headline. But now, replaying it, the careful tone in her voice took on new weight. She hadn't elaborated. She'd changed the subject almost immediately, asked about my granddaughter's party instead. I remembered, too, a visit about 10 months ago, before the cancer had progressed as far as it eventually did, when I'd been staying at the house for a week and noticed my mother kept a slim gray folder in the bottom drawer of her nightstand, tucked beneath a stack of old photographs. I hadn't looked inside it. You don't rifle through your mother's private things, not when she's sitting right there in the next room. But I remembered the folder because it was the kind with a little elastic strap around it, the kind used for something meant to be kept safe and separate from everything else. Was that the same folder Karen had produced at the coffee table? I tried to picture it. No. Karen's had been thin, plain manila, no elastic strap at all. A different folder entirely. I sat with that thought for a long time. There was something else, too. Something that had bothered me in a low, background way for months, and that I'd never let myself examine too closely, because examining it felt disloyal to Karen, felt like assuming the worst about my own sister. In the last year of Mom's life, there'd been a series of withdrawals from her checking account. I'd seen the statements once, helping Mom sort mail during a visit. Amounts that didn't line up with groceries or utilities. $2,000 here, $3,500 there. When I'd asked Mom about it, gently, she'd waved a hand and said, "Karen's handling some things for me. It's fine, sweetheart, don't worry about it." I hadn't worried about it. I trusted my sister. I still wanted to trust my sister. But sitting in my hotel room that week, I decided not to stay at the house any longer, given the new locks. I opened the small cedar keepsake box I'd taken from Mom's bedroom before Karen had a chance to go through it. The box where Mom kept old birthday cards, a lock of hair from each of our first haircuts, small ticket stubs from anniversaries. And near the bottom, beneath a stack of Christmas cards tied with ribbon, I found a business card, slightly yellowed with age but clearly kept deliberately, on purpose, in a box of things that mattered. Whitfield and Associates, Estate Law. Gerald Whitfield, Attorney at Law. I recognized the name distantly. A lawyer my parents have used decades ago, back when I was a teenager, for something related to my father's small business. I hadn't heard the name mentioned in years. Karen had certainly never mentioned him. The will she'd shown me had come from a different firm entirely, one I didn't recognize, with a much younger attorney's signature at the bottom. Why would my mother have kept this old business card, tucked deliberately into a box of things she loved, unless it mattered to her? I want to be honest. I almost didn't call. Some tired, grief-worn part of me told myself I was grasping at straws, that I was one of those daughters who couldn't accept being left out and was inventing conspiracies to soften the blow. I nearly put the card back in the box and let it go. Let Karen have the house. Let the whole ugly chapter close. But then I thought about my mother's voice on that phone call 14 months earlier, just tidying things up, and the careful way she'd said it, like someone choosing her words around a secret. And I thought about 31 years of her getting up every morning to teach other people's children to read, to be patient, to be fair, to notice when something was wrong even when a child couldn't say it themselves. My mother noticed things. My mother was careful. My mother did not leave important matters to chance. I picked up my phone, and before I could talk myself out of it again, I dialed the number on the card. It rang 3 times. Then a man's voice, older, unhurried. "Whitfield and Associates." "Hello," I said, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. "My name is Diane Ellery. My mother was Margaret Ellery. I believe she may have been a client of yours. I found your card among her things. She passed away recently, and I have some questions about her estate." There was a pause on the line, not a long one, but long enough that I noticed it. "Margaret Ellery," the voice said slowly, like he was turning the name over, placing it carefully. Yes, of course. I'm very sorry for your loss, Ms. Ellery. Your mother was a remarkable woman." Another pause. "I have to say, I've actually been expecting a call like this. I wondered when someone would reach out." Something cold moved down my spine. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The feeling of a door about to open onto a room you'd suspected was there all along. "Mr. Whitfield," I said carefully, "I think there might be something I don't know about." Gerald Whitfield asked if I could come to his office in person rather than discuss it over the phone. "Some things are better said face to face," he told me, in a voice that was kind but also, I thought, deliberately careful. The voice of a man who has learned over decades of practice exactly how much weight certain sentences can carry. His office was small, tucked above a bakery in the older part of town. The kind of place that looked like it hadn't changed its furniture since 1994 and didn't need to. Whitfield himself was in his 70s, silver-haired, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the unhurried manner of a man who had stopped needing to prove anything to anyone a long time ago. He gestured for me to sit, and before I'd even settled into the chair, he said, "Tell me what you know so far. I want to understand what you've been told." So I told him. I told him about the will Karen had presented, the one that left everything to her and named me nowhere. I told him about the locks being changed, about the realtor Mrs. Petrosky had seen measuring the yard, about the strange withdrawals from Mom's account over the last year that Karen had explained away as handling things. I told him about the gray folder with the elastic strap that I remembered from Mom's nightstand, a folder that didn't match the one Karen had shown me. Whitfield listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, occasionally jotting something on a legal pad. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at me with an expression I can only describe as sympathetic and grim at the same time. "Miss Ellery," he said finally, "your mother came to see me a little over a year ago. April of last year, to be precise. She came alone. Insisted on it, actually. Wouldn't let anyone drive her. Took a taxi herself, which I remember specifically because she made a joke about feeling like a spy." A faint, sad smile crossed his face at the memory. "She told me she wanted to update her will. She was very clear, very deliberate about what she wanted changed." My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. What did she want changed? "She told me she was concerned," Whitfield said, choosing his words with obvious care, "about certain financial arrangements that had developed between herself and your sister. She didn't go into great detail with me. She wasn't the type to speak ill of her children, even in a private meeting with her lawyer. But she used the phrase, 'I need to protect what's fair,' more than once. She told me she loved both her daughters equally and wanted her estate to reflect that, regardless of what other paperwork might exist or might be presented later. Regardless of what other paperwork might exist or might be presented later." I felt the floor tilt again, but differently this time. Not the sick, disorienting tilt of betrayal, but something closer to vertigo, from finally understanding the shape of the thing you'd been standing on all along. "She drafted a new will that day," Whitfield continued. "Properly witnessed, properly notarized, filed correctly with this office and with the county recorder, as is standard practice. It supersedes any prior will by virtue of both its more recent date and explicit revocation language. She specifically included a clause voiding all previous wills and codicils. In it, she named you as executor of her estate. The house, the accounts, and the remainder of the estate are to be split equally between you and your sister, with one exception: a specific provision directing that any funds withdrawn by Karen from her accounts during the final 18 months of her life be accounted for and deducted from Karen's share, unless satisfactorily explained and documented. I sat there in that small office above the bakery, and I began, quietly, to cry. Not from sorrow exactly, though there was plenty of that mixed in, but from something more complicated. Relief. Vindication. And underneath it all, a fierce, aching love for my mother, who even in her final year of life, exhausted and sick and surrounded by a daughter who was managing every detail of her care, had found the strength and the clarity to walk out to a taxi alone, to sit in this small office and quietly, without confrontation, without accusation, make sure the truth would eventually be known. She knew, I said. She knew what Karen was doing. I believe she suspected, Whitfield said gently. I don't think she wanted a war while she was still alive. I think she wanted peace in her final months. But she also wanted to make sure that when the time came, fairness would win out, even if she wasn't here to enforce it herself. He reached into a drawer and produced a sealed envelope, slightly worn at the corners, my mother's handwriting visible on the front. For Diane, when the time is right. She left this with me as well, Whitfield said. I was instructed to give it to you only after this conversation had taken place, not before. She was very specific about the order of things. I held the envelope in my hands and didn't open it. Not yet. Some things you have to be ready for. Mr. Whitfield, I said instead, my voice steadier now than it had been all week. My sister has changed the locks on the house. There's been a realtor out there. I believe she may be trying to sell it based on a will that isn't valid. Whitfield's expression sharpened, the gentleness giving way to something more purposeful. The look, I imagine, of a man who has spent 40 years making sure people like my mother don't get overlooked. Then I think, he said, standing and reaching for his coat, it's time we paid your sister a visit. I drove. Whitfield rode beside me in the passenger seat, a leather folio on his lap containing the second will, the notarized filing documents, and a formal letter he'd drafted and printed in his office before we left. A letter informing Karen, in precise legal language, that the will she had presented was no longer valid, that a superseding will existed and had been properly filed, and that any sale of the property or transfer of estate assets undertaken on the basis of the earlier will could expose her to legal liability. Neither of us spoke much on the drive. I remember the quiet of it. Not tense, exactly, but weighted. The particular silence of two people about to do something that can't be undone. Karen's car was in the driveway when we arrived, along with an unfamiliar sedan I didn't recognize. I'd learn later it belonged to the realtor, who had come by, with almost unbelievable timing, to walk through the listing paperwork that very afternoon. Mrs. Petrosky, I noticed, was in her front yard, trimming a hedge that did not, strictly speaking, need trimming, positioned with a clear view of the driveway. I knocked. It was strange, knocking on the door of the house I grew up in, but I no longer had a key, and I wasn't about to force my way in. Karen opened the door with a bright, brittle smile already in place. The smile of someone who has decided in advance how a conversation is going to go and hasn't yet realized the ground has shifted beneath her. That smile faltered, just slightly, when she saw Whitfield standing beside me. Diane, I wasn't expecting... Who's this? Karen, this is Gerald Whitfield. He was Mom's attorney. I kept my voice even. I wasn't there to shout. I had decided somewhere on the drive over that I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a scene, that whatever happened next was going to happen with the same quiet dignity my mother had used to set it in motion in the first place. "He has something you need to see." "I don't know who that is," Karen said, a little too quickly, glancing past us as if checking whether the neighbors were watching, which, of course, they were. "Mom's attorney is Mr. Palmer, from Palmer and Greaves. That's who handled the will." "Mrs. Ellery came to my office in April of last year," Whitfield said, his voice calm, professional, utterly unshakable. The voice of a man who has delivered difficult news 1,000 times, and long ago stopped needing to raise it to be taken seriously. "She executed a new will at that time, properly witnessed and filed with the county. That will explicitly revokes any prior wills. I have the documentation here if you'd like to review it." I watched my sister's face as he spoke, watched the practiced composure begin, almost imperceptibly, to crack. Her eyes moved to the folio in his hands, then back to his face, then to me, searching, I think, for some sign that this was a bluff, a misunderstanding, something she could talk her way around, the way she'd talked her way around so many things in the past month. "That's not possible," Karen said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Mom wouldn't have... She never mentioned any of this to me." "She wasn't required to," Whitfield said simply. The realtor, a young man in a gray suit who had been standing awkwardly in the front hallway with a clipboard, cleared his throat. "I think I should probably step outside," he said, and did, quickly, clearly recognizing the shape of the situation faster than Karen was able to. I stepped forward and held out the copy of the second will that Whitfield had prepared for this exact moment. "Read the date, Karen." She took it with hands that weren't quite steady. I watched her eyes move across the page. The notarization, the filing stamp from the county recorder's office, the date, 13 months before our mother's death. Months before the will Karen had presented to me at that coffee table with the pastries and the careful rehearsed speech about how things didn't work out the same way for her. "This voids the will you showed me," Whitfield said, not unkindly but without softening it either. "Any attempt to sell this property or transfer estate assets based on the prior document would be improper and potentially actionable. I'd strongly recommend pausing whatever arrangements are underway with the realtor." For a long moment, Karen said nothing at all. I had never, in 58 years of being her sister, seen her without something to say. Karen always had an answer, a justification, an angle. She stood there on the front porch of our mother's house, holding proof that our mother had seen through her, had quietly and deliberately protected the truth against exactly this moment. And for the first time in my memory, my sister simply had nothing. "I didn't," she started and stopped. "I was going to explain the money. I was going to pay it back. I just needed some time. And Mom said it was fine. She said..." "I know what she told you," I said gently, because despite everything, despite the locked door and the erased name and the coffee table performance, some tired, worn-down part of me still loved my sister and didn't want to watch her fully crumble on her own front porch with the neighbors watching. "I think she wanted to trust you. I think she also knew she needed to protect both of us, just in case." Karen's eyes were wet now, and I couldn't tell, I still can't fully tell, even now, how much of it was grief for our mother, how much was the particular shame of being caught, and how much was something more complicated that lived in the space between those two things. "Can we talk?" she said quietly. "Not like this, not on the porch." "Yes," I said, "but not today. Today, Mr. Whitfield needs the locksmith's information, and I need you to call the realtor and tell him the listing is off. We can talk about the rest when we're both ready." She nodded, slowly, and didn't argue. It took another 2 months for the estate to move through probate properly. Whitfield handled most of it, patient and precise, walking me through paperwork I'd never expected to need to understand. Karen contested nothing in the end. I think some part of her had known, even before I showed up on the porch that day, that what she was doing wouldn't hold up to real scrutiny. The withdrawals from Mom's account were partially repaid, partially forgiven under a compromise Whitfield helped us reach. And the house, my mother's house, with its overgrown garden and the kitchen window where she used to sit with her tea, was, in the end, split between us, exactly as our mother had wanted, exactly as she'd quietly arranged over a year before she died, in an office above a bakery, in a conversation she never told either of us about. I didn't gloat. I want to say that clearly, because I think it would have been easy to, and I think some people in my position would have. I didn't need to. The truth had already done the work that anger never could have. What I've thought about most in the months since isn't the will itself, or the locks, or even the moment on the porch when Karen ran out of things to say. What I keep coming back to is my mother, sick, exhausted, in the last year of her life, choosing not to have the fight, choosing not to confront Karen directly, not to make her final months a battlefield. She could have. She had every right to. Instead, she took a taxi alone to a small office above a bakery and quietly made sure that whatever happened after she was gone, the truth would eventually find its way to the surface, on its own time, without her having to spend her last months as a referee between her two daughters. That takes a particular kind of strength I don't know that I fully understood until I became a mother myself. And even then, not fully until I sat in Whitfield's office holding that sealed envelope. I finally opened it 3 days after the meeting on the porch, alone, at the kitchen table in the house I now technically half owned. My mother's handwriting, a little shakier than I remembered from my childhood but unmistakably hers, filled 2 pages. She wrote about how proud she was of the woman I'd become. She wrote about the flights I'd taken, the nights I'd sat beside her hospital bed, the tea I'd learned to make just the way she liked it. She wrote that she knew something wasn't right with the way Karen was handling things, but that she didn't want to spend her last year fighting about money instead of living the time she had left. She wrote that she trusted the truth to come out eventually, the way it usually does, and that she trusted me, specifically, to handle it with more grace than anger. Because that's who you've always been, even when your sister and I made that harder than it should have been. And then, near the end, one line that I think about almost every day now. Sedani's mother means loving them even when you can see clearly what they're doing wrong. I loved you both exactly the same. I just knew only one of you would need proof of it someday. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after I read it, in the house where I'd grown up, in the quiet my mother had left behind. Not the quiet of being erased, the way I'd felt it in those first terrible days, but the quiet of finally, fully being seen. Karen and I are not close, not the way we might have been in some other version of this story. But we talk. She came to me a few months later, on her own, and told me she was sorry. Not the rehearsed apology from the coffee table, but something rawer, more honest, delivered without an audience or a folder of paperwork to soften it. I don't know if we'll ever fully repair what happened, but I know that my mother's last, quiet act of love gave both of us the chance to try. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do isn't to fight loudly for what's right while they're still here to see it happen. Sometimes, it's to trust that the truth, carefully protected and quietly filed away, will do the fighting for you, long after you're gone.